justice. The Sustainable Developmental Goals are a call for action by all the countries, poor, rich, or middle income, to promote prosperity while protecting the planet. They recognize that ending poverty must go hand in hand with the strategies to build economic growth and address a range of social needs, including education, health, social protection, job securities, while tackling climate change and environmental protection. In today's International Research Conference, we will be focusing on SDGs 3, 4, 8, and 12, targeting good health and well being, quality education, decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption and production. Now, I request everyone to kindly rise for the Institute's anthem.
May I now request everyone to please be seated. Thank you. Before we commence the program, let's take a moment to remember the man whose dreams and aspirations motivated others to work towards the common goal of the nation. The man whose basic idea of governance was to hold the society together so that it can develop as a whole and march towards a common goal. Presenting to you now a glimpse into the life of the recipient of the Bharat Ratna Award, former Prime Minister of India, and a man of the masses, India's great son, late Shri Lal Bahadur Shastri ji.
सत्ताईस मई 1964 पंडित जवाहरलाल नेहरू का निधन हो गया। देश गहरे विषाद में डूब गया। सभी के मन में एक ही सवाल था, कौन बनेंगे नए प्रधानमंत्री, कौन करेंगे इस महान सभ्यता का नेतृत्व।
आफ्टर नेहरू नेहरू के बाद कौन होगा, तो ये उनको इस बात का एहसास था। जब मुझसे पूछा गया कि इस कमी को दूर कैसे करेंगे, तो उन्होंने कहा कि पंडित जी ने अपने व्यक्तित्व की वजह से, टावरिंग पर्सनैलिटी की वजह से उन्होंने इस पद को शक्ति प्रदान की, और मैं प्रयास करूंगा इस पद से शक्ति प्राप्त करने की, जिससे कि मैं देश की सेवा कर सकूं।
2 अक्टूबर 1904 के दिन काशी के पास मुगल सराय में जन्मे लाल बहादुर का पूरा व्यक्तित्व ही गांधीवाद का जीता जागता स्वरूप था।
उनकी सादगी, पहली बात तो धोती पहनते थे, ये आम आदमी को उससे बड़ा भरोसा हो जाता था कि हमारे जैसे है।
पिता की छत्र छाया बचपन में ही छिन गई थी। विधवा मां के साथ ननिहाल चले गए, वहीं पर परवरिश हुई। 1921 में जब स्वतंत्रता आंदोलन में कूद पड़े तो निष्ठा और दृढ़ता के प्रमाण मिलते चले गए। 17 वर्ष की आयु से स्वाधीनता तक लगभग 9 साल जेल में काटे। रहीमन हीरा कब कहे लाख टका मेरो मोल, पार्टी कार्य में उनकी निष्ठा से प्रभावित होकर नेहरू ने लाल बहादुर शास्त्री को रेल मंत्री नियुक्त किया। परंतु 1953 में घटी एक रेल दुर्घटना की नैतिक जिम्मेदारी लेते हुए शास्त्री जी ने मंत्रालय से इस्तीफा दे दिया।
उन्होंने वो इस्तीफा देकर राजनीति में नए मूल्यों की स्थापना की।
नेहरू जी के मंत्रिमंडल में कई विशिष्ट पदों पर अपनी छाप छोड़ते हुए वे गृह मंत्री नियुक्त हुए। 9 जून 1964 पंडित नेहरू के निधन के बाद स्वयं पंडित नेहरू के चहेते लाल बहादुर शास्त्री ने भारत के दूसरे प्रधानमंत्री का पदभार संभाला। कुल 4 शब्दों में उस मृदुभाषी व्यक्ति ने देश को एक नारा दिया, जय जवान जय किसान।
उन्होंने उस समय इस बात का एहसास कर लिया था, देश के अंदर हमें अपने जो भंडार है अनाज के उन्हें पूरा भर देना है और एक जो भारत के गौरव और गरिमा को देश विश्व में खड़ा कर देना है, वो अगर संभव है तो जवानों और किसानों की जय जयकार करने से ही है।
Lal Bahadur Shastri, Prime Minister of India, speaking on Independence Day in 1965.
हम हथियारों का जवाब हथियारों से दें।
5 सितंबर 1965 पाकिस्तान ने भारत के खिलाफ खुली जंग का ऐलान कर दिया। जवाब में भारतीय सेना पंजाब से सीमा पार कर गई। जब तक संयुक्त राष्ट्र की पहल पर युद्ध विराम हुआ, तब तक भारत की सेनाएं पाकिस्तानी सेना पर हावी हो चुकी थी।
वो किसी के दबाव में आने वाले व्यक्ति नहीं थे। जब ऐसी घटना होती है तो बहुत ज्यादा अंतर्राष्ट्रीय दबाव होते हैं। अगर आप दब गए तो झुक जाएंगे, वो नहीं दबे। लेकिन फिर शायद दोनों देशों की भलाई सोचकर वो युद्ध विराम पर राजी हो गए।
10 जनवरी 1966 ताशकंद। जिन आदर्शों के नैतिक बल का मजा वो पाकिस्तान को चखा चुके थे, आज उन्हीं आदर्शों की उदारता से उन्होंने समझौते के कागजात पर दस्तखत कर दिए। लेकिन अभी समझौते के दस्तावेज पर स्याही सूखी भी न थी कि उसी रात शास्त्री जी को दिल का दौरा पड़ा और उनकी मृत्यु हो गई। गांधी जी ने कहा था कि शत्रु का दिल जीतना ही वास्तविक जीत है। सुदूर ताशकंद में जब स्वर्गीय लाल बहादुर शास्त्री को कोसिजिन के साथ साथ खुद जनरल अयूब खान ने कंधा दिया, तो लगा जैसे शास्त्री जी बापू के फलसफे को चरितार्थ कर दुनिया से रुखसत हो गए थे। लाल बहादुर शास्त्री केवल 18 महीनों तक भारत के प्रधानमंत्री रहे, लेकिन अपने प्रधानमंत्रित्व के छोटे से कार्यकाल में शास्त्री जी ने भारत के हर नागरिक के कानों में आत्मसम्मान और आत्मबल का मंत्र फूंक दिया था। अपने व्यक्तित्व से उन्होंने निष्काम कर्म और पुरुषार्थ की वो मिसाल कायम की कि उनकी गिनती भारतीय इतिहास के सर्वोच्च महापुरुषों में होती है।
Following the tradition of Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management, Delhi, I invite Professor Praveen Gupta, Director LBSIM, Dr. G.L. Sharma, Head, New Projects, Colonel Ajay Sood, the Chief Administrative Officer, Professor Vikas Bhatnagar, Conference Chair, Dr. Gaurav Joshi and Dr. Anuj Verma, Conference Co-Chairs, Dr. Ishmita Singh, Member, Conference Core Committee, and Mr. Ankit Kumar, President Management Grid, to kindly light the ceremonial lamp and pay floral tributes to late Sri Lal Bahadur Shastri ji. Also joining us online is Sri Anil Shastri ji, who is the Chairman, Board of Governors.
I request all the dignitaries to kindly take their seats on the dais. Moving ahead, I take this opportunity to invite our esteemed professor, our director, Professor Praveen Gupta, to deliver the welcome address and declare the conference open. Professor Gupta has more than 3 decades of experience in the industry, teaching academic and administration, and making him a pioneer in both the industry as well as the academia. Before helming the institute as the professor, he has held many significant positions at the institute, specifically spearheading positions relevant to the institutional vision and endeavors. Professor Gupta has conducted various managerial developmental programs and corporate training sessions for junior and middle managerial employees at many leading organizations. He has worked with Fortune 500 oil and gas marketing giants, spanning over sales, marketing, and supply chain verticals. Please, sir.
Chief guest for today's inaugural program, Professor Debashi Chatterjee, Director, IIM Kozhikode, and also Professor in Leadership and Organizational Behavior. Guest of honor, Professor Mary Gentile, Professor of Strategy, Ethics, and Entrepreneurship, Darden Business School, University of Virginia. Shri Anil Shastri ji, Chairman Board of Governors, Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management, Delhi. Dr. Vikas Rai Bhatnagar, Conference Chair, Dr. G.L. Sharma, Dr. Gaurav Joshi, Colonel Ajay Sood, faculty colleagues, session chairs and co-chairs, participants, delegates, scholars, distinguished guests, dear students. it is indeed a proud day for us as international research of this scale and magnitude. I welcome all of you to the day-long proceedings on a very apt topic, crafting a better future, mindful and innovative practices for sustainability. At the outset, let me congratulate and all the staff members who have worked tirelessly for over 6 months to organize this international conference. And I'm very happy we had a very large number of scholars who have participated, sent their manuscripts, and it has been reviewed very carefully, putting in a lot of efforts. And this, let me share, in addition to so many tasks which each one of us is doing at the Institute. Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG as it is called, have been accepted by the UN General Assembly 2015, and it has been accepted by more than 190 countries. Out of 17 SDGs, we have chosen 4. They are SDG 3, SDG 4, 8, and 12. And they are focusing on good health, quality education, decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption and production. Mahatma Gandhi has said, and I quote, "An eye for eye will lead to the whole world blind." If we consume without focusing on sustainability and thinking about the earth, I think we are doomed to face the problems which we are facing. I'll just give you very brief 2 examples. The moment we had war in Russia and Ukraine, immediately there was a talk about the supply chain threats of food and also of energy. And mind you, in the first week itself, these threats started coming under discussion and in focus. Second example, cryptocurrency is a very new concept, and a lot of craze and buzz has been created around it. One Bitcoin transaction, it is said it is consuming energy equivalent to 8.9 houses of US. If it is 8.9 houses of US per day, I think in developing countries it can be 40 or 50 houses. We have to be very, very careful and mindful about any innovative practices and research and development or so-called development efforts we are making on this earth. What is the role of business schools? We have to make our students conscious. We have to make our students so aware about this planet and its requirement that when they join industry, they'll be more concerned, more socially oriented, and they will work towards the sustainable efforts of the industry and the entire community. With these words, once again, I thank Chief Guest for joining us early morning today. And we will be very eager to listen to your views on it. Guest of honor, Professor Mary Gentile, we thank her also because it is the midnight hours in US. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
so much, sir, for according a warm welcome and sharing your valuable views on the theme. Now, I would like to invite Conference Chair Professor Vikas Bhatnagar to introduce the theme of our conference today. Professor Bhatnagar is a veteran of the Indian Army, where he led companies from the front in operationally deployed areas along the line of actual control and provided assistance to the civil administration during times of national emergencies. Thereafter, Professor Bhatnagar joined the corporate and held senior leadership positions in reputed MNCs such as the General Electric, Bayer, Dr. Reddy's, and the last corporate role held by him was Senior Vice President of Human Resources in Shree Cement, one of the leading cement companies in India. The research interests of Professor Bhatnagar is on humanizing organizations. At the Academy of Management annual conference, which will be held in August this year in Seattle, Washington, Professor Bhatnagar will be presenting a new theory, the theory of profitable humanization. This theory, while sobering the controversy between the primacy of shareholder and stakeholder views, provides insights on how firms can be profitable despite considering employees as an end and not a means to an end. The paper that Professor Bhatnagar will be presenting at the Academy of Management is entitled The Theory of Profitable Humanization, the Coming of Employee-Holder and Human-Centric Organizations. Please, sir.
Thank you, Ashbir. I extend my warm greetings to each one of you and welcome you to the first International Research Conference of Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management. It is indeed a great honor for me to introduce the conference IRC 2022 to you all. I will briefly touch 3 points. First, around the design of the conference. Second, the way forward. And third, expressing gratitude to our keynote speakers. The design of this conference is an outcome of deliberations by the core committee with the program and area chairs. If you recall, sometime in the month of August, we had got into this discussion, and focus group discussions with other faculty colleagues. The design of IRC 2022 has been atypical. Generally, the keynote speakers are decided first, and they form an important influence in getting scholars to participate in the conference. Because this was the first international conference and we were not sure as to how many scholars would participate and the quality of papers, so we focused on the design of the conference, the content, and the value addition that we would be providing to the scholars. We are extremely pleased to state that we had 76 extended abstracts, and through a process of review, 46 high-quality papers are being presented in 10 tracks, 5 in the morning and 5 in the evening. Going forward, we have 2 journals, ABDC and Scopus indexed journals, wherein there is an opportunity for publication of 16 papers. So by 10th of April, we would send the shortlist of the papers, and then next 3 months following that, there would be review and revision, maybe 2 or 3 rounds, and then by July, these papers would be sent to the journals for publication. It would immensely please the chairman of LBSIM, our director, and the committee organizing the IRC 2022, that each and every paper which is presented here gets published. Those which can get published in the journals which we are associated, nothing like it. Balance in some other journals, maybe even of better impact factor. Next, regarding the gratitude, I have already shared through a video the scholarship of the thought leaders who would be presenting today for the conference. not only their thought leadership, but their humility, the humanism is also extremely inspiring. Each one of them is having extremely challenging times, whether professional or personal, and despite that, they have agreed to share their experiences and wisdom with us. We are deeply indebted to each of our keynote speakers. And lastly, how do we measure the success of IRC 2022? To our mind, it is only two things. First is the improvement in the scholarship, which means that all these papers getting published in journals, and the scholars who are presenting papers and the reviewers and each one of us experience improvement in our research capabilities. And the second is, if each one of us is able to take 2 or 3 points, 2 or 3 ideas that we can internalize and implement in our lives to improve ourselves and the communities around, I think it would be a good measure of the success of this conference. With these words, I invite you all to immerse in the experience of IRC 2022 and have meaningful conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for providing insights about the design and agenda of the conference. We look forward to the keynote addresses by Dr. Gentile and Professor Chatterjee, and to engaging conversations in the technical sessions ahead. I take this opportunity to introduce to you all our esteemed guest of honor for today's conference, Professor Mary Gentile, the Richard M. Walzer Bicentennial Professor of Ethics at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. Professor Gentile was inducted into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame for creating long-term impact on the way people think about and practice management. She has also been named as one of the 100 most influential in business ethics by Ethisphere, and her curriculum of giving voice to values has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Financial Times, McKinsey Quarterly, and is piloted in over 1,300 business schools and organizations globally. She has also held the positions of case writer, manager of case research, and faculty member at the Harvard Business School, and during her 10-year tenure, she developed and taught their first course on managing diversity and helped design its ethical decision-making module. She has also authored and co-authored many cases, articles, and books. I would now request Dr. Gentile to deliver the keynote address and impart her knowledge to the audience.
Have you briefed, sir, about sir, today's morning minute?
I would now request Dr. Gentile to deliver the keynote address and impart her knowledge to the audience.
Good morning. It's a real honor and a real pleasure to be with you this morning. For you, it's nighttime for me. I'm here in Massachusetts, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you at this IRC 2022 conference on creating a better future, promoting sustainability and well-being. And I thank Professor Bhatnagar for inviting me to share my thoughts and my work with something I call giving voice to values with you here this morning. Giving voice to values is a new approach, an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. In my mind, I've devoted much of my life, much of my work to creating giving voice to values and to sharing it around the world. And in my mind, I think when we're able to act effectively on our values, that is one of the best ways to promote well-being. And certainly these days, our values are closely tied to sustainability and to the UN Sustainability Development, Sustainable Development Goals. So I hope that these remarks will be useful to you today. Giving voice to values, or GVV, as I may refer to it, is really about asking and answering a new question when it comes to values and leadership. The typical question that we tend to ask in management education, in businesses, in organizations, and in our wider lives is, what is the right thing to do? We ask that question all the time. It's an important question. It's not an easy question, but it's important. But what I like to focus on is a different question. The question I try to focus on is, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how can you get it done effectively? What do you need to say and do? What will the objections, the kind of pushback that you might encounter look like? And then what would you say and do? And who do you need to involve in this process? And is this going to be a one-time conversation, a one-off exchange, or are you really trying to address systemic challenges in your organizations and in your society? And if you're trying to address systemic challenges, obviously they need to be approached systemically. It still makes room, it still requires room for individuals to take specific actions. You may need to think more incrementally and more long-term, but it still is something that we need to think about. How do we do this effectively? I focus on this question for a number of reasons, but it really grew out of my own experience. I worked for 10 years at Harvard Business School, and while I was there, I helped to create their first required curriculum around values-driven leadership and ethics in business. And since then, I've worked with schools around the world and with businesses and other organizations. And I have to say that the reason I developed Giving Voice to Values, or GVV, as I refer to it, is because I became very frustrated, very disillusioned, very discouraged with the way we approach these kinds of issues around values and ethics in our businesses and in our wider lives. We tended to approach them as if they were entirely cognitive problems, entirely intellectual challenges. We focused on creating intellectual decision-making frameworks, but we didn't focus on action. We focused on decision-making, but not implementation. We focused on rules, but no tools. We acted as if you could only have a kind of decision-making framework, a sort of black box, and you could put all the information in one side, and the right answer would come out the other side, and then we would be done. I call that the preach and pretend method. We would preach to you about what the right thing to do is, and then we would pretend that you knew how to do it, that it was going to be possible for you to do it. And it didn't seem realistic. And with the students that I worked with in business education, and with the practitioners, the businessmen and women that I worked with in organizations, they also knew that it wasn't realistic. You know, it seemed like a theoretical discussion, but it wasn't something they could actually put into practice in their lives, no matter how much they would like to do so. And, you know, I have to say that I used to go into classrooms or I would go into corporate settings to do conversations and trainings. And what I would often see is that we would present people with um, case studies, thorny ethical dilemmas, difficult challenges, and we would ask people to read those and then to come into the discussion. And they usually would come into a discussion with an idea of what they thought the right thing to do was. But then in the course of the discussion, two things would happen. The first thing that would happen is that people's thinking would become more complex. They would begin to realize that, you know, maybe I didn't have all the information. Maybe this is just the way it's done in this company or in this industry or in this part of the world. Maybe it is a problem, but if I try and do something, it's above my pay grade. It's not my responsibility, and I might even make it worse. And so all of these kinds of concerns and fears and reasons and rationalizations would come into people's minds. And so they would, although they entered the discussion with an idea of what they thought was right, by the end of the discussion, their thinking would be more complex and sometimes more confused. But I actually think that's a good thing. You don't want people to walk into these kinds of decisions naively. You don't want them to walk into these situations assuming they know more than they do. But the second thing that would happen in these conversations was more troubling to me. I don't know if you have this experience in your organizations or in your classrooms, but I would find that often when I would have a discussion with a group, there would be a few people in the room that when they spoke, everybody would turn to listen to them. Maybe they were the most articulate. Maybe they were the ones who always had a witty story to illustrate their point of view. Maybe they were simply in organizational settings, maybe they were simply the people of the highest rank. But whatever it was, when those individuals spoke, the ones that everyone listened to, they would be the ones who would be expressing the most skeptical, if not cynical positions. They would be the ones who would be saying, Mary, I know what you want me to say, but in the real world, that's just not possible. And so I felt, gee, you know, we go into these conversations about values and ethics and sustainability and leadership, and people are walking out of these conversations more confused and less empowered. And I thought, that's really not what I want to spend my life doing. Life is short. I want to do something that matters. And so I decided to take a step back from this work. I was disillusioned. I was discouraged. And around that time, this was about 15, 20 years ago, around that time, I had a number of experiences, and I also began to see a number of different forms of research that led to the creation of what I now call Giving Voice to Values, or GVV. I won't tell you all the stories and experiences tonight because I know we don't have that much time, but I'm happy to share them with you another time. But I will tell you a little bit about the research that I came across. And as I said, this was maybe a dozen years ago. There was starting to be a lot of research in the areas I'm going to discuss. There's actually more now. But the research that I started to see was suggesting that if you really want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal and practice and pre-scripting and peer coaching are very effective strategies. So for example, when I was still working at Harvard, I came across two different research studies, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London, and they both independently decided that what they wanted to do research on was what they were calling moral conviction. They were trying to study people who had acted with great conviction in times of very high risks, high stakes. And they both independently decided they were doing qualitative research. They both independently decided they were going to do in-depth interviews with people who are often referred to as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who acted with great conviction during the Holocaust to help and save the lives of people who were in danger. And so they identified groups of these people and they did these in-depth interviews and they wanted to find out, did they have some common family background, some personal experiences, some religious background? Did they have, any kind of factors in common that would lead them to act with that kind of conviction when so many other people did not? And so they did this research, and they came across a number of factors. And the one that really resonated with me was this. They said the people who had acted with this kind of conviction in these high-risk situations all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they had had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, with someone more senior to them. So it might have been a boss, a manager, it might have been a teacher or a mentor, or even a parent. But they had the experience of this person more senior to them posing a question and asking them, what would you do if you encountered this morals conflict? So, of course, they couldn't have anticipated the Holocaust, but they did have this experience at both the cognitive or intellectual level and also at the behavioral level of prescripting and rehearsing and coaching. So at the cognitive level, they had the experience of literally naming the values that matter to them and putting an articulation to it, a set of words. And at the behavioral level, they had the experience of voicing this value out loud to someone more senior to them, who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to speak with in the actual circumstances. So I thought to myself, this is kind of interesting, this idea of both prescripting and rehearsing and then getting feedback and coaching. And I decided that let's look at if there's more research on this. And so, as I said, there was starting to be a lot of research. So in the field of psychology, you may have seen there's been research on habit formation, how we create new habits of behavior. There's also a group of researchers in psychology who study what we call positive deviance. These are people who study those who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And they have a really nice phrase. It's their phrase, not mine, but it kind of captures what I'm talking about. They say, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more impactful to ask them to act their way into a different way of thinking. Consider what that would mean for your educational experiences, for your efforts to engage in various forms of sustainable action. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And then I looked at some of the research that's been popularized recently around cognitive neurosciences. And you've probably read studies about brain plasticity and about creating new neural pathways, so certain kinds of behaviors become more frequent, more common, more natural. But the research I want to tell you about today comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. And I'm going to tell you a little story because I think it illustrates what I'm trying to talk about. So back when I first started to work at Harvard Business School, I decided that I needed to take a self-defense class. Now, I was a lucky person. I had never felt the need to take a self-defense class until I went to work at Harvard Business School. At that point, I thought maybe I should do this. So I looked around Boston, and there were a lot of these courses, and they all teach pretty much the same thing. They teach you the physical moves. They teach you fist to bridge of nose and heel to instep and knee to groin. And they invite you to practice these moves in the air. And the idea is now, if anyone ever attacked me, I would know what to do, right? But there was one class that was different. It was called model mugging. and it was a developmental model. So they would still teach you all those moves and you'd rehearse them in the air. But once you knew the moves, they would bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man, if you've ever remembered those ads. And they would line us all up, and we would take turns getting attacked by this gentleman. And you could use the new self-defense moves that you had learned on him full force because he was protected with all this padding. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked. And then you got to practice the moves. But as the class went on, week after week, I might be talking to someone over here. He would come and grab me. I would never know when. I would never know what hold he was going to use. It was utterly nerve-wracking. But the idea was that if you practice something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in the moment, your body would remember. Specific state muscle memory. So, if you're an athlete, you'd be familiar with this. Let's say you're a tennis pro and you would practice your serve over and over before you go to the tournament, because then when you get there, under all that stress, your body will just naturally assume the proper form. And so that was how they were teaching us to defend ourselves. We would have the opportunity to practice these moves under this kind of stress to create a muscle memory, a specific state muscle memory. So one day I'm in this class and I'm lying on my back on the floor because I have failed to protect myself when the gentleman tried to attack me. But I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a default behavior, a default to speaking up, a default to voice, but not just to, shaking your fist and speaking truth to power, not just speaking up, aggressively, but rather informed voice? Because one of the things that I was learning as I gathered many, many stories and did interviews with people about times when they had acted on their values and when they had not acted on their values in organizational settings. People at every level, from junior people right out of school all the way up to C-suite executives. And I would gather these stories. And one of the things I was learning is that although they were voicing their values and acting on their values, they typically were not doing it in an accusatory way or an aggressive way or a whistleblowing way. They were being much more tactical, much more strategic, much more nuanced. And so could you create a muscle memory, a default to informed voice? And so that was the idea that I had. And I thought, what would it take to teach people to do that? And so when I looked back at what we actually did when we taught people about values and leadership and ethics, I became discouraged again, because we tended to just teach people how to recognize issues and how to analyze them. And then we pretended we were done. And I realized we needed to teach them how to act on their values. And so we created a new kind of teaching technology, a new pedagogical approach. And I call it the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment. And what it is, it's case-based. I very much believe that actual case examples are a very effective way to teach. But unlike traditional case studies, the kinds of case studies I wrote when I was at Harvard, these are different. These cases are often very short. They feature people at every level in an organization. And the important thing is they end with an actor who's already decided what the right thing to do is. And the discussion question, the teaching question is, how could he or she get the right thing done? And so what the students or the practitioners do in these training sessions and in their educational settings is literally create scripts and action plans and coach each other on how to get something done. Now, we call it a thought experiment because I never ask people, here's a values conflict, here's an ethical situation, what would you do? The reason I don't ask people that is because we know from the research that when we encounter values conflicts in our lives, we typically don't sit down and make a pro and con list. We don't sit down and consider what would the philosophers tell us, what would our guides tell us. We typically react more emotionally. We react automatically, even unconsciously. And then we rationalize after the fact why what we did was the right thing to do, or why maybe it was the only thing we could do. And so instead, I ask people, what if? It's a thought experiment. What if you were this person who has decided this is right? And so what you're doing to be more creative and to actually be more effective and to begin to develop that moral muscle memory that I was talking about. What you're doing is you're creating a new habit. And so I created hundreds of examples of these sort of thought experiments. They were all based on real situations of times when people encountered values conflicts. And we created lots of exercises and tools and a protocol, a set of steps to work people through. And we made these materials available for free. And we invited people to begin to experiment with them. And this was, as I say, about a dozen years ago. And it was somewhat I was actually frankly surprised because the approach caught on rather quickly. It's now been used all over the world, literally on all 7 continents, even the Antarctic. Although we started it for business schools, it's now been used in companies, in organizations, in the US military, in the Australian police force. We're working on projects in Africa and in Ireland and in the US and et cetera, et cetera. We've done a lot of work in India that I'd be happy to share. We have quite a few examples that are based on Indian examples. In fact, India was one of the first international places where I was able to bring giving voice to values. And I had such a good experience that I was able to come back many times to different cities and share the approach. And what I've found is that people are attracted to this approach because it's action-based, because it's powerful, but it's accessible. And that's part of the reason why companies like it too, because what they see is that when they use this approach with their employees are learning not only to be able to act well when they encounter ethical conflicts, they're beginning to learn how to act well in any kind of leadership situation, and in particular, positive leadership around sustainability and issues of that nature. So I'm going to conclude because I know that we have a lot of wonderful speakers coming up, but let me just say that you've probably understood by now that the idea behind giving voice to values is simply a reframe. Instead of asking what's right, we start with the question, once you know what's right, how could you get it done? And we engage people in that problem solving and rehearsing experience, which builds the confidence and the competence for them to be able to act on their values. And it's based on what we call the 3 giving voice to values flips, or the 3 GVV reversals. We've reversed what it is we're talking about when we talk about values in our organizational lives. We've reversed who we think we're talking to, and we've reversed how we have the conversation. So in terms of what it is we're talking about, it used to be when I was first starting to teach in business ethics at Harvard, and then when I went to other places, it used to be that we would always say, don't bother to discuss clear-cut, easily discernible, right and wrong, black and white type issues. Those are too easy. You should focus on the gray issues, the issues where it's not really clear what's right. And I used to think, yeah, that makes sense. That's how I will teach about this. But I actually have changed my mind because I find that if you focus on the gray issues, you never get to a discussion about action. You spend all your time debating how many angels dance on the head of a pin. You spend all your time debating on whether it's right or wrong, or whether it's possible to act, and you never unleash people's creativity and ability to think about how to act ethically and in a values-driven way. So we focus on issues where most people, not everybody, but most people would agree that's clearly wrong, that's clearly fraudulent, or that's clearly over the line, or that's clearly abusive. And instead of focusing on whether it's right or wrong, we then can get to a discussion of action. And it's interesting, I've found that I wasn't sure if this approach would work in different cultures, and I've found that it's very well received, partly because there are some core values that are true of human nature, and those tend to be pretty widely shared. The context that people operate in is very different. And so how difficult it would be to act on their values or the kinds of pressures they encounter will be different. But the values themselves, the high-level shared hypernorms, as philosophers call them, that are shared by human beings, and those are the ones that we try and address. So that's how we've shifted what it is we're talking about. The way we shifted who it is we're talking about is this. It used to be I'd go into a classroom or an organization and people would say, most of the people here are good people. We just have a few bad apples, and those are the ones this training is for. But I actually think of our audience, whether it's a classroom or a company or other organization, I think of the audience differently. I think of it as a bell curve. And this is based on some research by Greg Dees and Peter Crampton. And so what we do is we think of the audience as a bell curve, and at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists. And we would define opportunists as people who would say, I will always act to maximize my personal self-interest, regardless of values. Now, nobody falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are the people who would say, that's my primary motivation. And at the other tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would say, who would self-identify as idealists. And these are the people who would say, I will always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my self-interest. What we premise is that the majority of us fall under the bell. I put who would say, I would like to act on my values, as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying as long as I know I'll succeed. It's not the same as saying as long as I know I'll never pay a price. It simply means I think I have a chance. I think I have a shot. So if you think of your audience that way, I don't believe I have the power to change the opportunists. I think they'll always be with us. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I would like them to be more skillful, to be more competent. But we're really focusing on those pragmatists, the majority, and we're trying to say, we want to give you the skills. We want to give you the literal scripts. We want to give you the positive examples. And importantly, the rehearsal and the practice and the pre-scripting and the peer coaching to develop that muscle memory, that moral muscle memory, to enable you to be who you already want to be at your best. We're not trying to change you. We're trying to enable you to be who you want to be at your best. And our premise is if enough of the pragmatists and the idealists become more skillful at this, become better at this, it changes the water that the opportunists are swimming in. And so the calculus that they do to determine what is in their self-interest has to change because they can't rely on the same level of silent complicity from everyone else. And so that's how we've shifted who it is we're talking to. And finally, we've shifted how we talk about values and leadership. And I've already explained that to you. Instead of asking what's right, we say, once you know what's right, how do you get it done effectively? And we engage you in that rehearsal and that pre-scripting and peer coaching. So that's GVV in a nutshell. I'm very humbled and honored that so many folks have found the approach itself useful. There's a lot more to it. There's 7 pillars. There's books and articles on different topics, etc. But the core idea, and the idea that I hope you would walk away from this with, is that we actually have more choices than we think we do. We often shut down our sense of what's possible, whether it means resisting unethical behavior or whether it means pursuing positive behavior, sustainability, for example, in our organizations. We often shut ourselves down prematurely because we don't believe we have a choice. And then I think by implementing a GVV strategy and approach where we ask the thought experiment, the what if question, and enable people to begin to come together in that creative way, that innovative way, and that less stressful way to practice and rehearse, I find that people can do many more things than they thought they could. So thank you for the opportunity to share these ideas with you today. I always tell people once I've had the chance to share giving voice to values with you, whether you like it or not, you're in my life forever. So I invite people to be in touch with me through my email at the University of Virginia. Professor Bhatnagar knows how to reach me. And I do hope that this idea, this framework of choices and asking how can you get the right thing done rather than whether, will be a helpful sort of framework for your next conversations in this conference. It looks like it's going to be a wonderful conference. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for shedding light on what GVV is and examples of how one can adopt what to do when faced with a value conflict. And we would like to express our gratitude to you for joining us this late in the evening by presenting to you a memento. This token is sourced from Khadi Gram Udyog, and the concept of Khadi was developed by Mahatma Gandhi ji to provide employment to the unemployed rural population during India's struggle for independence. Moving forward, I would like to ask Professor Bhatnagar and Professor Praveen Gupta to present it to ma'am. Moving forward, our chief guest today is Professor Debashi Chatterjee. He's the director of the IIM Kozhikode and has taught leadership classes at Harvard, IIM Calcutta, Lucknow, and Kozhikode for nearly 2 decades and has been awarded the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship twice for predoctoral and postdoctoral work at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. His published work includes 18 books, including the recent release Karma Sutras, Leadership and Wisdom in Uncertain Times, Leading Consciously, and Timeless Leadership that have been translated in several international languages. He has served as Director General of IMI Delhi, India's first corporate-sponsored business school, and as Independent Director on the boards of several multinational and Indian companies. He has also served as Dean of IIM Lucknow and Dean of a global business school in Singapore, and has trained and coached 30,000 managers and 25,000 school principals, spanning an academic career of 30 years. Sir, we are extremely honored to have you today with us. And now I request you to kindly share your actionable learnings on leadership through the inaugural address. Please, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Mr. Anil Shastri, Chairman, who I greatly admire, and his father is iconic. We grew up learning about Lal Bahadur Shastri, so when a request comes from an institution that bears his name, it is impossible to say no. Dr. Praveen Gupta, Director, Professor Mary Gentile, whose work is so impactful, and I was almost tempted to tell her that for every word that she used, there is a corresponding word in the Vedantic tradition, but I will resist that temptation for some time. Professor Vikas Rai Bhatnagar, Conference Chair, Dr. Gaurav Joshi, Co-Chair, the panel of experts and scholars and students who are attending this conference. From giving voice to values, I'll move on to giving voice to a vision called Vedanta. You know, the word Vedanta is fairly well known in Indian context, not as well known globally. So just to let you know that Indian culture is based on a body of knowledge. The 4 Vedas we all know about. This knowledge came from the rishis, the seers, who in states of deep meditation capture the Vedantic knowledge or the Vedic knowledge. This vision unfolds through a tradition. Everything that we see, everything that there is, Vedanta says, is awareness. They call it by different names, Brahma, Ishvara, whatever. But the fact is, this whole vision is transferred orally. So it is essentially a method of transferring vision. And that method is called parampara. Parampara is a tradition, right? So I'm going to look at the issue of sustainability and the assorted issues that Professor Mary Gentile raised so potently from the perspective of Vedanta. So what Vedanta does is it gives us blueprints for our humanity in terms of how we interact with our environment, And Vedanta says nothing really is sustainable in the world. Nothing is sustainable except the thought, the knowledge that nothing is sustainable, the awareness that nothing is sustainable. And so this awareness is most critical. Vedanta is a vision statement of wisdom, and Bhagavad Gita is a case study. You've done case studies, and you know that Gita is essentially based on the field of action. And it has nothing to do with the sophistication of Vedantic philosophy. It is about action. And what is this action? It is happening right in the middle of a battlefield where this extraordinary warrior called Arjuna has a performance breakdown. This is essentially a performance breakdown, not a moral breakdown, in the middle of a war. And you can imagine what happens when you stop performing in the middle of a war, when you're besieged with emotional issues backed by the ego. And there's a conversation right in the middle of the war with a person whose name is Krishna. And Krishna is convincing Arjuna that he has to evolve from being a fighter to a warrior, and that's a very different story. And this is a story that unfolds as a conversation. The thing that she was so vocally referring to was there's a difference between knowledge and knowledge that can be acted upon. The first kind of knowledge is cognitive. You know a lot of ethics. You've studied the world of values, and you've got lots of stuff fed into your head. And so this is cognitive. This does not translate as action. So values that are espoused in the head but not practiced in action, this is called jnana. And the values that are embodied and practiced. So I have a lot of knowledge, but I might not be able to act on that knowledge. And this is precisely what has happened to Arjuna. This man is a warrior who's not able to apply his knowledge of how to go on to his business of fighting a war of redemption. And this is something that distinguishes between Gyan and Vigyan. And there's another word that Professor Gentile used, which is the default response to, because through repeated practice you make action choices almost automatic. This is called samskars in the Vedantic tradition. Samskars are something that you have lived for a long time, and so when you act out of your samskars, you're acting out of those default choices that you've repeatedly gone through. That's the kind of practice that you've gone through. And so if I now look at the Bhagavad Gita, the scope of the Gita is essentially that it is about timeless backdrop. Book is because at the Harvard Business School, Ken Goodpaster, who was teaching a course on business ethics, showed a film to everybody present, and the film was called The Parable of the Sadhu. If you've studied ethics, you can barely miss that film. It's such a popular film. And I was asked this question by a bunch of Harvard professors, what is the meaning of the word sadhu? And I racked my head and I said, sadhu simply means good. You have an expression in India called sadhu, sadhu, which means good. And I also said good not as opposed to bad, but good as that which also encompasses, accepts the bad and transforms it. So sadhu is not good in the sense of good behavior, good standards. Sadhu is a transformative word. And so you have to understand that this goodness is something very different from the goodness that we generally, talk about in common parlance. So what is the scope of the Gita? Gita was essentially a battlefield sermon. And what happened here? We are talking here about something that is timeless. And why shall we talk about timeless in the context of leadership? Although we know that leadership is essentially a contextual phenomenon. Leadership differs from place to place, from country to country, from situation to situation. What is so timeless about leadership? The thing that is timeless about leadership are essentially values. And you have to understand that, you can see tulips in Holland, where the tulips will be arranged in a linear order. You can see a Japanese garden where everything is non-linear. Then you can see a Pukalam in Kerala, India, if you come here. Then you see the arrangement is largely circular. And so what we see is essentially different kinds of flower arrangements, but the underlying values are the same. What are those values? Symmetry, harmony. And if you understand those common values, shared values of leadership across cultures, then you'll understand Gita is a treatise on values, and the Indian word for it is dharma. You have to understand what dharma means. Dharma is not religion. Dharma is not, a particular cult. Dharma is the holding capability, something that holds some things together. Dharma of water is hydrogen will mix with oxygen in a certain proportion to produce water. That's the dharma of water. And it will be consistent across the spectrum. So what you call values are essentially a degree of consistency that you have achieved in cultures and societies. What you call a brand is essentially consistency of values in a very inconsistent world. The reason we talk about Lal Bahadur Shastri or Mahatma Gandhi is because they had a consistency that was rare. They had one standard. And that one standard came out of repeated understanding of the deeper layers underlying the diversity of the world. Now, if I go to the depth of what it is, then you have to essentially see that when this dharma percolates a system, it's like an ice cube that you put inside a glass. The ice cube will dissolve, but it will cool the glass uniformly. It will be cool at every part. So dharma is like that. It is actually dissipates through a system because it brings about a deep consistency, a deep coherence between what you say, what you think, and what you do. Manasa vacha karma. Right? And so when you talk about timeless leadership in the context of the Gita, we are talking about the context of a performance breakdown. And Arjuna says he can't fight anymore. And Krishna seems to tell him that, look, here is an Eve teaser, a land grabber. Called Duryodhan, there are protons and electrons in the physical universe, but there are morons in the human universe. Duryodhan is a moron. Why is he a moron? Because he violates the laws of nature. He violates dharma. He's been an Eve teaser and a land grabber, and he needs to be punished according to the law of the land. It is another matter that you are doing the punishing, Arjuna. Anybody else in your place will be just as good. You are a nimitta. Nimitta means a conduit. A conduit. And so you are just a conduit for acting on behalf of the larger cause-effect relationship in nature, and you are doing nothing more than that. Very interesting. And so Arjuna says, how do I do that? And he said, not with the agitated mind that you bring here, because your agitated mind is a mob of thoughts and emotions. It loses the power to act in a dharmic way. When you are fragmented, like Arjuna is, our experience is like that of a man who is drowning in a storm-tossed sea. How does he act under such circumstances? He has to hold on to any straw to save his life. But you have to understand Arjuna's dilemma. He says to Krishna, the mind is restless of Krishna, turbulent, strong, and unyielding. It is difficult to control it as it is to control the wind. Mary Gentile was talking about multiple ways of rehearsing values. Krishna says there is only one way. There are no multiple ways. There is no multiple intelligence. There is only one intelligence. That intelligence is when you are concentrated in your mind, when you have ekagrata. You have access to values. The moment you become ekagra, one-pointed in your mental process, you'll be able to pierce the diversity of aspirations, diversity of motives, and find out there's one underlying unity behind these motives, and that unity is what you have to look at, right? So, Krishna knows that he is not able to deal with it, and Krishna knows that he is active by nature, but his activity is stopped because he's not able to process his mind. So the first aspect of values is that can I bring ekagrata where there is bhavamukita, where there is diversity? Can I bring a certain quietness? You have to identify with a mind that has become one-pointed. And when it becomes one-pointed, you realize that this body, this physical body that I was thinking that I got so identified with, is a false identity. This physical body is just the cover for something deeper. And Krishna says, Arjuna, mortality that you are afraid of, you're afraid of killing your superiors, your parents, is nothing but your idea of death, because the soul self never dies. If it only changes costumes as it takes up and discards bodies. Your suffering is based on nothing but a disposable idea. What is a disposable idea? That I am the body. This idea called I am the body goes counter to values. So if you have to live a life of values, life of sustainability, if you're stuck to I am the body, you cannot ever go in the fear of values. Values are not about the body. Why do I plant a tree? Why do I have children? Why do I build an institution for the future? Because it will live beyond me, beyond my body, right? So this whole thing of getting stuck in the framework of a physical body, you can't talk of sustainability when you are conditioned by I am the body idea. Because you have to go beyond your body. In I Am Kozhikode, in 2012, we had a vision called 2047. We created a coffee table book, and I circulated the book to several chief ministers of the country, to the chief justice, to the PM, prime minister of the country. I got several very encouraging responses until I realized that in 2047, people who drafted this will never be alive. But 2047 was critical because we have to understand what should we stop doing now in order to remain relevant in 2047. And believe it or not, all of a sudden I realized that all the ministries have been asked to create a vision of India at 2047 because it has caught the fancy of the leader of the nation. And he says, we need a vision for India for 2047. And a little thought here that went beyond our own end of aggrandizing our own self in the process of life can unleash so much inspiration around. And you'll see very soon a plethora of ideas, initiatives coming around 2047. But it started here in I Am Kozhikode through a coffee table book. I'm going to share that with you at some point in time. So fundamentally, Krishna is holding up a vision of something much bigger. He's saying to Krishna, Arjun, see, the ego makes you an asymptomatic idiot in the unfolding drama of life because your ego is saying that you are the body. And you see bodies around you. What you're seeing are principles in operation. What is seeing is dharma playing out through embodied dharma, through this physical body. And these bodies are temporary wrapping papers for something deeper that hides inside the body, the aspiration of the human being. And so if I have to understand what it is, you start with ekagrata. So the entirety of the Gita is essentially based around a mental process called ekagrata, one-pointedness. And if you have achieved that, then you realize that there are only three things that actually come in the Gita, and I'm going to finish this in about 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'm going to conclude. The first element of timeless leadership is purpose. The second is performance. The third is possibility. Now, if you look at purpose, what would be the dharma of business? As a corporate warrior, what would be the dharma of a manager? To make money or to create wealth? To make money would be a very, very basic activity, transactional in nature. But if you talk about creating wealth, then you go beyond making money to making people who would make the money on a sustainable basis without destroying the environment. All right? And for that, for creation of wealth, you need deeper reflection than the ability to make money. What kind of reflection do you need? You need reflection in terms of referring to your own self. And you said, well, I have the ability to act to make the money, but how do I make the money in a way that sustains my world? The CEO of Interface once told me, and he's the largest carpet maker in the world, that if I continue to make carpets destroying the earth's resources that I'm doing today, in 50 years' time, I'll be in jail, given the fact that there will be laws that will put me in jail, literally. And so making money, the way I'm making money is not sustainable. And so for that, we need reflection as to how do we make this money? What are the values behind it? And so we need a lot of reflection. Just as without a Krishna, there is no Arjun. Without reflection, there is no action. Without an Aristotle, there is no Alexander. Without a Chanakya, there is no Chandragupta. And you see, they are very complementary capabilities in the human being. The complementarity of reflection and action. And this complementarity is often forgotten in the business world. If you ask yourself, what is my complement in terms of reflection? Do I have enough reflection time? Do I quietly sit with myself to understand which direction my action is going? That is a very important issue. And what you call purpose is how you integrate with the larger reality, the larger dharma of the world. So what is the purpose of Arjuna fighting the battlefield? He's not a fighter. He's not fighting for redemption. He's not fighting for honor either. He is fighting for a cause, which is called dharma, which is the larger order, which if violated will bring out chaos and crisis. And so essentially sustainability principles are based on this whole issue of dharma, which is of course not touched in the UN resolutions because not many people interpret the dharma accurately, right? So we are looking at the second element, which is performance. And you ask, what is performance really? What is performance? Is it activity? Or is it a way of managing interference to your own capability? You know, if you look at the conversation in the Gita, it is not really about performance in the conventional sense. It is about potential. So performance is that which minimizes the interference to my potential. If small p is your performance and big P is your potential, then you realize why small p is always small, always. Why do I perform always less than my potential? Because there is a pattern of interference in my life. The first pattern of interference is the ego, right? And that pattern, if it is not destroyed, will lead us to all kinds of performances that are going to be destructive, that are going to be non-sustainable. So if you look at what happens if you're on a ship that is anchored and you're trying to move the ship, will the ship move? It will not move because the anchor is not lifted. So if the anchor of the ego is not removed, your performance will move around a narrow vortex of self-aggrandizement. It will not go anywhere. And this is fundamental. So if you have to ask, how do I improve my performance? You have to ask that more relevant question. How do I unleash my potential without the interfering patterns? Whether it comes from a culture, or it comes from an ego, from the organization, that's what you're going to ask. And finally, you have to look at the world of possibility. You know, our minds are very linear, and we do not understand that there is a possibility beyond our mental map of the world. So if I pick up a piece of paper and I tell you, no, this is a 1 millimeter paper, and if I ask you to fold it 30 times, one time folding, if I ask you to fold it 30 times, you know, and if I ask you what would be the height or the depth of the paper if you fold it 30 times between here and the moon, right? You can't even imagine that here. If I were to ask you how much speed would you work up on a bicycle that you will design, you will say probably 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers, but you will see an American woman design a bicycle per hour, right? And you'll be wondering why. I mean, I can't imagine that possibility because our minds are very linear. They're not able to see a world that is not accessible to my senses. So how do I go to this world of possibility? It is to be able to see the observer. This is the Vedantic way. If you become aware of the limitations of your mind, if you have a practice that says that your mind is limited in a small way, there'll be great humility that you'll see a world of possibilities beyond your mental frame that you cannot even imagine. The moment you start observing your mind, you start changing your mind. You start changing your things. The CEO who is enlightened, he's not doing any more than you are. He is observing more or she is observing more. The very nature of the observer is called silence. All our Upanishads end with 3 words. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Shanti means silence. Shant. It also means peace. But fundamentally it means Shant. So Krishna reveals to Arjuna, himself to Arjuna, this is the last conversation that I'm going to share with you. He says to Arjuna, amongst the immovable things, I am the Himalayas. Amongst the secrets, I am the silence. Timeless leaders understand the virtue of silence. While silence creates, speech expresses. Silence is that which connects the voice of the timeless with our own times. And you will have to bear with me because I'm going to talk on silence. I'm just going to play a short musical rendering. A composition with Pandit Vishuman Bhatt that I put together in Mumbai. The words are mine, the music is his, so please pay attention. This is my last reflection in silence. So there you are. Can you hear the sound? If you can't hear the sound, I'm going to conclude here. Can you hear the sound? Couldn't share sound, so sound can be shared. All right, so since you can't, if you're missing the sound, you're missing the beauty of it, but I'll read out the poem anyway. Then the mother of a deaf girl with muted sorrow in her eyes said, tell us about silence. Ananda waited for the murmur of the eucalyptus leaves to whisper its last secrets through the hills. He seemed absorbed in a wordless conversation with himself. Many Then the mother of a deaf girl with muted sorrow in her eyes said, "Tell us about silence." Ananda waited for the murmur of the eucalyptus leaves to whisper its last secrets through the hills. He seemed absorbed in a wordless conversation with himself. He seemed absorbed in a wordless conversation with himself. As he said, silence is the womb of all that is spoken and heard. Silence is the flow of the river of intelligence. Like river banks, words are mere interruptions of this flow. Silence is the unspoken truth of the universe. Words are best masks that embellish the face of truth with their many devices. The forlorn lover sitting on the edge of the river pines for a lost love in dumb despair. Only numbing silence, only numbing silence, only numbing silence, only numbing silence. Only numbing silence connects heart with heart. In silence, words return to their essence just as noisy rivers merge with the ocean. Through words, one becomes many. In silence, many return to the one. In silence, creation happens. The master in us has created a house called the universe. Through words, we knock at the door of this house. In silence, the chest of treasure is flung open. Speak, but do not stand in the way of the music of silence. Your words are useless without the music. The original voice of life is silence. All other noises of the world, all other noises of the world, all other noises of the world, all other noises of the world are mere echoes. Thank you for your time and your patience, and I'm sure the conference will be a grand success going forward, and there'll be many streams of thoughts and ideas that will enrich you. And with these words, I wish you the very best. for the success of whatever is in store for all of us and you going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for demystifying the Bhagavad Gita and highlighting its relevance in leadership today. Also, we thank you for sharing the circle of love with us. We would like to present to you a token of appreciation from our end as a handwoven khadi shawl. I'd like to request Dr. G.L. Sharma and Professor Praveen Gupta to present this memento to Professor Chatterjee.
Thank you.
Moving forward, it is an honor to welcome our chairman, Shri Anil Shastri. Shri Anil Shastri, son of late Shri Lal Bahadur Shastri, second Prime Minister of India, graduated in economics from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, and did advanced management program from Asher Management College, UK. He has done General Management Program from Administrative Staff College of India, Hyderabad, and Business Management Program from Tata Management Training Center, Pune. He has served the corporate world for around 2 decades at very reputed senior positions. He is the Chairman, Board of Governors, Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management Technology, Bareilly, and Chairman, Board of Governors, Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management, Delhi. From being an active member of the Indian National Congress to sharing his wisdom on Twitter, he has been a real inspiration for everyone present here. I would like to request Sri Anil Shastri to deliver the presidential address for the IRC 2022. Please, sir. Sir, you are on mute.
Dr. Praveen Gupta, Director, Lal Bahadur Management. Dr. G.S. Sharma, Dr. Vikas Bhatnagar. Distinguished speakers, including Dr. Debashi Chatterjee, whom I've met before, Director of Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode, faculty and students of Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management. At the outset, I wish to compliment the LBSIM for having organized this international conference, Research Conference 2022. And I'm sure that the distinguished speakers who have already spoken and who are to speak in the course of the day will go a long way in promoting leadership qualities and traits that are necessary in the transformed world today. The theme of the conference, Creating a Better Future, Mindful and Innovative Practices for Sustainability, is perhaps in vogue, and that is what is required. I would personally like to mention here, because Dr. Debashi Chatterjee mentioned about Lal Bahadur Shastri. And I've always said that Lal Bahadur Shastri had no formal education in management, but he did practice all modern concepts of management, what is being taught today and what is being practiced today. And yes, of course, management education does help one conceptualize issues, conceptualize matters, but there is no substitute for experience. We have known so many great political leaders, social leaders, as well as business leaders who have had no management education in their lives, in their careers, but have made a mark in their respective fields. I'm sure that the distinguished speakers who have spoken and who are going to speak today will definitely give a great advantage and benefit to the budding managers who are studying here in Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management. As I mentioned about Shastriji, so I was not there for the first speaker, but what Dr. Debashi Chatterjee mentioned about Gita, Dharma, and purpose and performance. I remember, though, when he passed away, I was only 17 years old, but he would perhaps practice in all these jargons that we are talking about, marketing jargons or leadership jargons that we are talking about. We have jargonized these concepts, and it is all right for management education. But as I said, that is, for example, for me, myself, I think so many management programs I've rendered, but on-the-job training that I got in Voltas was much more than what I learned in different management schools and management programs. So I would once again like to compliment Dr. Praveen Gupta and his team for having organized this International Research Conference 2022, which is perhaps the first of its kind in the recent past that the Institute has organized. And I do hope that during the course of the day, during the deliberations, there will be a lot to learn, and the Institute and the students of our Institute are going to greatly benefit from what is being said today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your invaluable thoughts on the conference and its theme. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Gaurav Joshi, conference co-chair, to deliver the vote of thanks to our guests. Please, sir.
A warm good morning to everyone present here and virtual guests. I deem it a great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this occasion. First and foremost, I thank Chief Guest for International Research Conference 2022, Professor Debashi Chatterjee, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode, who despite his busy schedule has found time to grace the occasion. He beautifully explained the meaning of word Vedanta with the help of our traditional Vedas. He also discussed different style of leadership with the help of Bhagavad Gita. It's really amazing to listen your views, sir. Thank you very much for enlightening us with these new concept of leadership with the help of Bhagavad Gita. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Professor Mary Gentile, Professor Darden Business School, University of Virginia, for accepting our invitation as a guest of honor. She spoke about new theory giving voice to value, which is a new area of our research. Thanks for sharing your experience in conducting such kind of new research, ma'am. I am sure it will definitely motivate each one of us to conduct research for making this planet better. Thank you very much, ma'am. And I like to express my sincere thanks to Sri Anil Shastri ji, Chairman Board of Governor Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management, for always providing encouragement to organize such big event. Thank you very much, sir. I also wish to express my gratitude to Professor Praveen Gupta, Director Lal Bahadur Shastri Institute of Management, for his valuable guidance to make this event successful. Thank you very much, sir. And I would like to thank all distinguished invitees, scholars for attending this conference. My heartfelt thanks to all my faculty colleagues and administrative colleagues for their support for organizing this conference. At the end, I would like to thank member of management grids and all student bodies involved in different tasks to make this conference successful. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now we come to the end of the inaugural session of the IRC 2022. Further today, paper presentations will take place in various tracks, which participants are requested to join through the links already shared in mail with them. After the track presentations, all the participants are invited to the Valedictory cum Awards session, which is to be held at 3:45 p.m. in the hybrid mode. We once again thank all present here in the auditorium and all present with us online for joining us this morning. Thank you.